Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's informational webinar, Lacey's Evolving Role in a Local Government Perspective. I'm Rick Walk, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Lacey and Project Manager for the Lacey Work Group on Homelessness. And this work group comprises of a diverse group of Lacey community members appointed by the City Council with the charge to listen, learn, and discuss the issues of homelessness, and as well as reach out and get community feedback and develop recommendations for the City Council to take in responding to the homeless issues. These webinars are intended to provide background and information to the work group as well as the broader community, and will feature subject matter experts from our region who will discuss current conditions, provide insights to the services available, offer a variety of perspectives on topics ranging from behavioral health, funding, services, housing, and more. Now, this is a reminder, these programs are recorded and will be posted on the city's website. So if you cannot see these videos or webinars live, you will be able to review the recordings and still get the information that's shared tonight. And again, tonight's webinar topic is Lacey's Evolving Role, a Local Government Perspective. And our speaker tonight is City Manager of the City of Lacey, Scott Spence. So Mr. Spence has served multiple roles for the City of Lacey since arriving at the city in 1999, first as the city's Public Affairs Director, then the Assistant City Manager, and Scott became the City Manager of the City of Lacey in 2011. And Mr. Spence brings a wide variety of experience and skills to the city manager position as he oversees operations ranging from all aspects of the city: financial, economic development, operations, everything you can imagine. So we're really excited to have him here tonight. In addition, Mr. Spence is a member of the International City Council Management Association. He is on the board of directors of the Washington State City, County, and Management Association. He is also a member of the Board of Regents of Leadership of Thurston County and vice chair of the South Sound Military Partnerships. So he has a broad perspective and aspects of city government. So I'd like to again welcome Scott tonight. But before I turn it over to Scott, I first want to remind our viewers that how our program is formatted. We'll have the formal presentation for the first part of the webinar, and then we'll open up to the question and answer portion at the conclusion. So as you listen to Scott's presentation and questions come to mind, please submit those through the chat feature of the webinar platform. And we'll collect those questions, and at the question and answer point in time, we'll moderate those to Scott for responses. So with that, again, I would like to thank Scott for joining us tonight and turn over the webinar presentation to him.
Rick, thank you. And I just want to thank really the group of citizens that have volunteered their time to actually work on this issue. The City Council is extremely concerned about the issue of homelessness and what it's actually has transpired in the last 4 to 5 years. And really the input of you being part of this work group is going to be instrumental in actually guiding that policy decision. So appreciate the time and effort. I know it takes a lot of time out of your day, but I appreciate the fact that you're taking this issue seriously enough to give our guidance to our City Council. So today I thought I was asked to provide kind of some perspectives on the issue of homelessness. And as Rick said, I've been part of the city for 21 years. And I want to go through a couple slide set. I have another slide set. If we have time, we can go through that too. But I'd really like to hear some of the questions and answers from the work group participants and see if we can provide some additional insight that maybe you have not had so far. So with that, I'm going to share a screen and begin my presentation. So Rick was kind enough to do a quick bio. I won't bother you with more than that. I will say I do have a dog and a cat just to make myself a more well-rounded person. So just want to mention that. Hey, first of all, I want to say that you live in a great community. City of Lacey is just under 53,000 in population. We're the 24th largest city in the state of Washington out of 281. We identify ourselves as a military community. We have strong ties to Joint Base Lewis McChord and have really great veteran support within our community. As you may know, that we are the first city to have a Divergent Diamond Interchange in Washington State, which is exit 111. That's kind of an innovative engineering feat in terms of interchange traffic control. As an organization, we have 287 full-time employees. As most of you know, we have a council manager form of government where the city council sets the policy, and then they hire a professional manager to execute the operations of the government. Our budget is just under $52 million for our general fund. So that's what it basically costs to provide the services to our 53,000 residents. We're proud of the fact in terms of being good stewards of our dollars. We have a AAA rating, which is a pretty high achievement when it comes to being financially in terms of stewardship of those public dollars. That's something we take great pride in. And you may recall we were rated in 2019 Money Magazine's top 100 places to live within the United States of America. So again, another reason and validation that we're a great community to live in. So I guess to begin the discussion about homelessness, there's just a couple things I want to touch upon, because quite frankly, when you talk about the issue of homelessness, there are a number of factors that are competing for your local government's time and attention, and really our bandwidth on how we try to deal with these issues. So first of all, it does come down to money. In terms of the city of Lacey, as I mentioned before, we have a $52 million general fund operating budget, but we do have limited revenues and resources that can be directed at this issue. That's not saying that we want to go get more resources, but at some point there is a finite amount of money that we can spend on this issue. And as we all know, there are many costs associated with trying to help people out of homelessness. I'm going to go into some more detail, but there have been recent legal decisions that have really shaped the landscape of in dealing with this problem of poverty and homelessness, to the extent that it's really put some very defined sideboards on what a city cannot do, especially a public entity. When we talk about how we are organized as a city, it is affecting really all aspects of the city operations. We don't have a division of homelessness or social services. This is really a shared responsibility between police, public works, community economic development, the city manager's office, public affairs. It really runs across the entire organization. And of course, really the main driver in all this is really community support or even opposition when it comes to this issue. It does gauge or also restrain or contain or our ability to actually respond to this issue. And we need to be mindful of that, and we are responsive to what the residents believe that we can do and what we should do, given our sort of constitutional responsibilities and other state laws that affect this issue. Plus, there's regional expectations. We are in a very regionalized area with Thurston County and also being home to the state capital. And there are different expectations that come along with this issue. And we do have a lot of shelter resources that are centered in our capital city, which also provides a different layer of communication and ongoing responsibility with this issue. There's also just the ability or qualifications of our service providers. I think we're dealing with a new era of homelessness that we've not seen really in the last sort of 10 years. And in terms of that issue, we need to adjust and respond to what the current conditions that we're currently dealing with right now. So that's another issue. And then going back to our jurisdictional responsibility, we still have a community to maintain and operate. We have 287 full-time employees. We have 53,000 residents. We have 16 square miles in the community that we're trying to maintain with streets, with parks. Homelessness now becomes another area of basically another responsibility that, quite frankly, we are not, as I said before, modeled to directly impact that issue. And then, as we're all know, and I know we're all tired of talking about it, but pandemic, or the COVID-19 pandemic, has added another layer of complication on this issue of homelessness. I think a question that comes up a lot, and I understand it, but a lot of residents who've been here for a long time, or even people that have been here in the last, say, 2 or 3 years, they want to know why homelessness is more visible. Traditionally, I think people were used to maybe the visibility of homelessness in the downtown core area and the city of Olympia. Again, that's where some of the social services were centered in, but the new phenomena, if you will, is we're seeing far more visibility within all the communities. And you're seeing homeless encampments on I-5 and in the right-of-ways. You're seeing in other parts of the area. Sometimes private property owners have also experienced people living temporarily in their areas. And so this has become, again, a more growing concern within our community that we've actually paid more and more time and attention to. And we'll go through some of the policy timelines too, but I'd really say that this is in the last, say, 4 years, this has really accelerated. This is obvious to all that's on the panel, but it bears worth repeating, is the fact that we are in a very multi-jurisdictional area. And so you can see on the screen there, City of Lacey, in kind of that light blue, but then also you have I-5 that runs through our community. And quite frankly, that has become an area where homeless encampments have actually been established. And so that becomes an issue. Now we're trying to engage the state of Washington and see what their role is in terms of homelessness and actually outreaching and helping those individuals who find themselves on that state of right-of-way. City of Olympia, I mean, you're right next door. Anyone lives here, you can drive really 5 minutes in almost each direction and you're in a different jurisdiction. So that begs the question or the need that we need to have more jurisdictional cooperation when it comes to this issue. I think we all know homelessness has no boundaries. And so the issue is what we do affects Olympia and vice versa. What Olympia does affects the City of Olympia. I'm sorry, the City of Lacey. And so again, that just goes back to the premise of no boundaries. So I want to kind of hit on some legal decisions. And I guess going back to the original question, why is homelessness more visible really in the recent years? I would say it boils down to some recent legal decisions, some precedent setting, and some kind of forecasted that this issue would be more of a topic of conversation for communities and how they handle this issue of homelessness. So really the first one is the Everett camping ordinance. And just real quickly, this was not a precedent-setting legal decision. But in this, and just to give you a very high level view of this, is that this was a case where someone was living in an RV on a city street. They actually plugged in their RV into a nearby, actually adjacent hotel with their telephone and power lines. And it violated the camping ordinance that was set up by the city of Everett. Essentially what the courts viewed was that their camping ordinance was too broad. And so then you start getting into this issue about camping ordinance and what is it trying to accomplish. And in the ordinance in Everett, basically what they had the language of camping paraphernalia. So no one could use any public property, street or park, and bring camping paraphernalia. So the question for the courts we're struggling with, does that include a tent, or does that include me having a picnic and I decide to bring a Coleman stove and I'm basically trying to cook some, lunch or whatever for that day's picnic. So that became an issue with that, and that kind of invalidated that camping ordinance. So again, it wasn't precedent setting, but again, that was probably an early cue that some of these camping ordinances that communities had, were they too broad or overly broad? Then we have another one, Jones versus Los Angeles. So that was in 2007. This becomes the issue of more of the appearance of people either sitting or sleeping or lying on public streets or sidewalks. And essentially what happened was Los Angeles was enforcing that you could not. What that ended up is a challenge by the ACLU into a lawsuit. And they basically came to a settlement that said essentially that we'll go ahead and build 1,250 low-cost housing units, and we will drop this suit. So essentially Los Angeles went ahead and agreed to that. So they went ahead and built those low-cost housing units. And so they basically didn't get into the issue, which ACLU was claiming was that was an Eighth Amendment issue, which essentially is what you're doing is cruel and unusual punishment for, in a sense, the crime does not fit the punishment, or the punishment does not fit the crime. And so that is the first sort of aspect or maybe indicator, again, that issues relating to someone who has nowhere to go, using public property as, say, maybe for sleeping or lying, even also parks, we're starting to run up against constitutional issues. So another one which kind of hits at the aspect of homelessness was Anderson versus Portland. Again, this is another settlement that did not reach the courts, but again, it informs another layer of this issue. So what happened was a situation where when they cleared out an encampment, the question was, were those occupants given proper notice? So in terms of the settlement, what was agreed to is that the city of Portland would give 24 hours and not more than 7 days notice. And if they took items from those occupants or individuals, then they would be photographed, inventoried, and there'd have to be some way that those people can actually claim those pieces of property. and then also required training for those offers. So again, this gets into this point where maybe if a resident sees an encampment and maybe does not look that as out having any value to that individual, there's this argument about, well, if the tent is the only thing that they have that is of value, and a city can't come in and clean up an area and basically just discard those items. So again, that was another informative decision. So this is probably, I would say, the biggest decision, which was basically solely within the state of Washington. So this was an issue between the city of Lakewood and Willis. So what happened here was, and all cities in the state of Washington have anti-panhandling ordinances. What cities are trying to achieve in this ordinance is trying to prevent an activity that could be disruptive to traffic, or it could be in an area where people feel unsafe. And so they're trying to regulate the activity of panhandling. So essentially what the state Supreme Court weighed in on this issue, because it eventually went to the highest court in the state, they eventually said, look, you can't cite someone for freedom of speech issues, such as I will work for food, or do you have any money? If you have a sign, they're doing nothing wrong other than trying to communicate maybe their current need at the time. So every panhandling ordinance that any city had became invalidated after this decision. And what you started to see is that when the city stopped enforcing the panhandling ordinances, you started to see a more visible, more individuals on street corners. In a sense, what we traditionally viewed as panhandling is saying, I will work for money, I need food, I'm poor, I'm homeless, will you help me? And so that became, I would say, the most visible change in the landscape in the last 4 years. And then I'm sure everyone's heard about the Martin v. Boise, and this becomes really probably the landmark case in terms of how cities can regulate their own public property for the community. And again, without getting into a great amount of detail, and I know that Kelly had set up all these documents, so if people want to go in for a deeper dive and look at all these cases, you'll have that information at your own time. But essentially what this did was in Idaho, the city of Boise was trying to enforce someone from not sleeping in their park. And what they did is they tried to direct them into a shelter resource. The long and short of it, the courts weighed on this issue and said essentially that you cannot criminalize homelessness. So there's some other issues with this court case where they went to Salvation Army, which is a religious institution, which also had some other implications for other constitutional rights. But essentially what cities are prohibited from doing, if someone has no ability, meaning they don't have a house, they have no other property, they have nowhere to go, they're indigent, and they end up sleeping in the outdoors, public property, then a city can't come and then find them or arrest them or do any other sort of law enforcement activity that would be punitive. So that was essentially the landmark case that has really sort of changed the entire landscape on how cities are trying to deal with this issue and regulate what in general was public property in a lot of cases in terms of rethinking how we actually manage that with that issue when it comes to homelessness. Now, part of the difficulty with this one case is though, because you're homeless, it doesn't really define homelessness. It just basically you can't deprive certain rights from individuals, and that one right is the right to sleep. And so that where it gets at the heart of the Eighth Amendment. So that becomes the landmark case that essentially everyone has been reaffirming in the last couple of years. And then Blake versus City of Grants Pass, which is in Oregon, in a sense hit up against the same issue. And so same kind of situation, the person was sleeping in a park, they were fined, the fine was almost $300. And what they said is this person has no means to pay that fine off given their current financial position and homeless status. So why are you continuing to fine and punish this person for something they have really no outlet for? So from that perspective, again, the Eighth Amendment comes up again, just like in Martin versus Boise. And so now cities have really been told not just once, but twice, that this is an area where if you're going to enforce an ordinance that regulates public property on the means of camping, it has to be justified on one, is there shelter available? If there's not, then you have to provide some allowance for that person to stay for a period of time, which is not defined. And then that person cannot be punished for doing so. So there's your legal landscape. And so I think what happened with all these cases is that, one, it challenged the thought of existing policies. So when we had panhandling ordinances for the intent that we were looking from a public safety standpoint, trying not to disrupt traffic, that becomes invalidated by the challenge with City of Lakewood and Willis that you cannot do that. That's a freedom of speech issue. Suspension of specific enforcement, Martin versus Boise, which again is a Ninth Circuit Court decision which affects multiple states. That clarifies, again, if the person has no means, and I guess coupled with the fact that that community has no shelter resources, that person cannot be punished for doing something they have no control over, which is sleep for the night, or even other issues related to that. So there is some, again, as I talked before, there's no legal definition what homelessness is. There's no definition if you have so much money in your bank. I mean, there could be some specific. There's no guidance on terms of, how long do you have to wait before you can enforce it? Does that mean all day? Does that mean 10 hours? And so again, there are some unsettled questions on that, which has caused some confusion. But that is the legal environment that all cities, counties, and really state government are operating on when it comes to anyone occupying public property if they're deemed homeless. So some of the outcomes of these legal decisions, I'll kind of talk about how that's affected us locally. So first and foremost, we do also have a camping ordinance. And a camping ordinance is just, we're trying to manage land use activity. I mean, you can't camp anywhere you want to. But you may notice, and I think you could probably see this, and I'll try to highlight this. So given the recent court decisions and being informed by Martin versus Boise, as well as the one in Los Angeles, since we do not have adequate shelter resources for the region or for the city of Lacey, we have a very specific timeline that you're allowed to be on a sidewalk, if you will, from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., but then after 7 a.m., then you do have to move. That means, in our opinion, the premise or the limits of Martin versus Boise. So it's not being punitive. That doesn't give someone right to occupy, basically a portion of the sidewalk or in front of City Hall or some town square forever. But it does allow them from 10 to 7 a.m. if they have nowhere to go. That means they actually could come back. Now, again, if we had more shelter resources, then you could enforce that code provision and they'd be taken to the shelter. And so that's how that process would work with a camping ordinance. So again, that's an outcome of some of the legal challenges that happened that preceded this, where we finalized ours. And then the other thing that's affecting really the current environment that we're currently working in right now is the governor's proclamation as relates to COVID-19. There's some other CDC guidelines in terms of basically limiting the capacity of shelters. And so that's obviously caused an issue with our current capacity within the region. There's the eviction moratorium that's been extended, which is obviously a nod to try to prevent people from entering into homelessness. And there's all this issue, which has really not been I'd say decided, is this issue of RVs. If you're in an RV and you have nowhere to go and you're parking on the city street, are you homelessness? If you have a RV, is there a connection there? Now, the Attorney General opinion weighed in that if you happen to be in an RV and you've parked on a city road for more than 14 days, you would fall under the eviction moratorium. Now, it's just an opinion, but again, that adds another layer to what we're talking about in terms of how we're trying to navigate this issue. So I want to talk a little bit about timeline on certain things that the city council has tried to impose and work on and try to alleviate some of this issue. And this is just more of a high level policy timeline, but we had been working on a camping ordinance since 2017 as this issue had become more prominent. So that was the first instance where we talked about it, but we tabled it back in 2017. We made a good effort with our religious organizations to find out what faith leaders were willing to do to help with this. That's a natural partnership with faith-based organizations to do charitable causes. And so we initiated that in 2018. In 2019, we finally did enact, the city council enacted the camping ordinance, which I explained before, which was informed by legal decisions. The Planning Commission spent the better part of a year trying to figure out emergency housing, which overlaid with the issue of homelessness. Those are well-attended meetings. I must say they had at least 3 meetings that filled the council chambers. It's a very hotly debated issue. And there was a lot of, I would say, anger expressed, frustration, and concern about what are we doing about homelessness. And then we had events like Council on the Road to try to communicate what we were trying to do. And then really at the end of 2019, because of this issue kind of hit a boiling point, council said we need to have our residents weigh in on this issue on a more concerted, concentrated basis, which is why you're here tonight, to actually work on homelessness, engage the community, and then come back to city council ultimately and provide guidance. In 2020, obviously, we are working on regional issues. We formed a new partnership called the Regional Housing Council. There is a correlation with homelessness and affordable housing. And so what can we do as a region to expand that and expand that base? If anyone is driven by Fred Meyer next to 108, you're now seeing a very visible homeless encampment. There's about 31 individuals there. That is on DOT property, but that's obviously associated with the city of Lacey. So we've talked with the state. This is an issue where people should know this is right of way, which is not considered public property. But because of the pandemic and because of, I would say, the state's unwillingness to enforce their right of way, we basically finally came to an agreement with DOT to said, well, if you're not going to enforce it, we need to at least try to stop it from growing. And so we agreed to a DOT agreement with, an agreement with DOT that said, look, you have 31 occupants here that can't grow. We will trespass. We are granted that authority. And we have our community resource unit as well as our social service navigator trying to place them in coordinated entry or other services so they can find themselves out of that area of 108. And then again, I mentioned pandemic responses have put additional constraints in relation to capacity at shelters, but it's also provided the COVID-19 Relief Act, which has provided a fair amount of money at the state level as well as the local level. Even here regionally, we received well over $700,000 to deal with eviction notices, to deal with utility bills, and we gave about another $250,000 to United Way to deal with social service issues. Here's just a couple pictures of just kind of demonstrating that this topic of homelessness and I think the concern that these have been well-attended events and people have been wanting to know more information about it. The one up on top is Council on the Road, where one of the issues was homelessness. That was at Salish Middle School. And then at one point you may have known in the paper that we were trying to look at a place where people could safely park RVs, and we were proposing Main Street, which is an unfinished road that goes into the Gateway project. And that met with a large amount of opposition, which ultimately the city council backed away from. And then we decided to contain that in our back parking lot. And so we learned a lot from that experience in terms of how do we manage that? So it seems like quicker than I thought it would be, but here's a couple observations. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. If we have more time, I could do some additional slides. But I guess the first role is that I think homelessness is pushing the traditional role of cities of our size. I'm not saying that urban cities like Seattle or obviously Los Angeles, New York has not dealt with homelessness. But in terms of a 50,000 plus community, this is kind of a new territory in providing homelessness support at this level. I'd already mentioned the limitations on funding. I think that's a catch-22. I think in 2017, there was a report in the Seattle Times that showed that the city of Seattle, in combination with King County, spent $200 million trying to respond to homelessness. I think anyone has anecdotal information that goes up from, say, Lacey and Thurston County to go visit Seattle. It seems to me that the homeless situation in Seattle has only grown despite putting, $200 million into that effort. And that was just for 1 year. I mentioned that we met with our religious organizations. I think what we found out through that experience that faith-based organizations have concerns about trying to service the homeless when it comes to liability, and I'm not quite sure they're prepared. And a lot of the organizations that we met with have older congregants that are just not have the ability to be able to maintain or manage a shelter operation. And so that's an area where I think it was an aha moment that there was not more faith-based organizations willing to come forward to maybe alleviate some of this. Maybe it'd be one or two. It could be an RV model. It could be housing individuals, but that's an area that we thought there would be more participation. I think one thing from a perspective of the city manager is the fact that I think our social service model is inadequate. I would tell you when I first got here in the, in the early 2000s, our social service model, it worked. It wasn't perfect, but we had the Salvation Army, we had Union Gospel, we had Bed of Roses, we had United Way, and essentially we had at least enough capacity where people could get help, and the homeless issue was not at the scale that it was. And I think the system was able to maintain that. I think the thing that has changed, there's been a breakdown in infrastructure with mental health facilities. And then what we're seeing is, and we don't talk much about it when we talk about the narrative of homelessness, there is a large population that is inflicted with mental health issues that find themselves being homelessness. And then we also have another population that has drug addiction. And when I say that the social service model is inadequate, that what we need is more mental health clinics, and we need more drug rehabilitation clinics. We are not going to make meaningful progress on the issue of this current homeless crisis that we're currently in now without those two service models or those resources. I just don't see that happening. If this was a situation where someone was, missed a paycheck, had the inability, they lost a job, we have services and outlets and organizations that help with that. But I think we are inadequately prepared to deal with the person who has chronic mental illness that needs more services and support if they're going to be successful or successfully get out of homelessness. I think that's difficult. I think in general, the community is very frustrated by this issue. I would tell you as a city manager, I'm frustrated with this issue. City council's frustrated, staff is frustrated. It's not as simple as we often get emails to say, well, I don't understand why you just basically arrest these people. Why don't you move them off? And as we already talked about with the constitutional issues and the legal issues, a city can't do that. The last thing you want is your city violating someone's constitutional rights and trying to enforce your way out of it. And plus, it does not solve the problem. So that is, I think, a frustrating part for the community when they see something growing. It looks like that we're not doing anything. We are trying to do things, but at some point, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have some of the tools that we're going to make meaningful progress, which happens to be, again, the mental health facilities as well as the direct rehabilitation facilities. And unfortunately, that is going to take resources and I would say expertise beyond the ability of your local government. That's where we need the state of Washington to be an active participant. That is a key issue for me where they're on the sidelines, I feel, and by their inability of taking direct action, the communities are sort of, in a sense, victim of how to deal with this issue without the tools to actually, provide it. I'm also struck by the fact that we have this issue, and I do think that we are a compassionate community, but I feel like we are kind of rewriting the social contract a little bit. And I've always kind of wondered at what point, what is the community's responsibility versus the person's responsibility? I can't help an individual if they're unwilling to get out of the current situation. And then again, I go back to the mental health issue and the drug rehabilitation issue. If you have a person suffering from mental illness, they're probably not going to make logical decisions to get out of their current situation. If you have someone that is basically paralyzed by drug addiction, they're probably not going to make good personal choices. But there is some merit to discuss the personal accountability of those individuals involved because we can't do it alone. If we're going to basically provide the community support, the community outreach to help these individuals, they have to make a personal choice to be able to get out of that situation. Otherwise, we're going to be in this weird status where we're not making any progress. And let's be honest, and I don't think we talk about this enough, this really is a quality of life issue. This is the quality of life of our community. I don't think anyone would expect the community standard that it's okay to be living in the woods. It's okay to have makeshift shelters for people of any age to be out in the woods during, the entire year. And it's not good for that individual. At some point, it's heartbreaking for the person that's in that situation, regardless if they're trying to find themselves out. We shouldn't have that expectation or standard that is okay. At some point, we need to have more dialogue. So what are we going to do to basically not only help the individual, but what is the community standard? Because I don't think the community standard is having people live off the side of the road or in the I-5 right away is a solution. Now, if that means we need interim shelter in the process, the question becomes, well, where do we put it? Is the community going to accept that? Are we willing to get more resources to do mental health facilities or drug rehabilitation facilities? Those are all questions that we need this work group to weigh in if we're really going to solve this problem. Otherwise, what's going to happen is this problem is going to stay in its sort of current course. It will grow, and then we're going to spend more money, not necessarily solving the problem, but just servicing the problem, which at some point we need to redirect the limited resources we have in a better direction. So that's kind of a high-level observation about homelessness. I want to make sure that we have enough time to answer questions. I do have another slide deck that kind of talks about all the series of things the city has been working on when it comes to affordable housing, veteran support. We can definitely get into that too, but again, I just want to provide that perspective and then answer those questions for the work group. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, fantastic, Scott. Thank you very much for that very thorough and good presentation on the pressures the city faces in dealing with the homeless issue and trying to find solutions that the community can accept. We do have several questions that came in while you're presenting. So at this point, we'll start the question and answer period, and we'll go out in order. And again, as the attendees think of questions, please make sure you send them in, because we do want to make sure we take the opportunity to engage with the city manager at this time and glean any valuable perspective that he may provide. So with our first question, Scott, the question is, we learned that there is no cold weather shelter for women in the county. Could the unused historic train station replica amenity be used? And I'll add on to that question, if not, are there other resources out there that we could use for a cold weather shelter for women?
So traditionally, we have made available, we call it the White House, but there is a two-story structure in the community, or the Woodland Community Park. You've probably seen that if you're going down to the park and by the playground that oversees Long's Pond. And we've made that available for shelter resources. And this kind of goes back into the city's sort of not structured to kind of be able to do that. So we've made that, and we've also talked to providers and said this is available. The problem we're having is there's no provider that's able to take us up on that call. So we traditionally did the White House for emergency cold weather shelter. At that time, Salvation Army was willing to provide the supervision and the support, and also the transportation, because even if we go to, say, a facility like the White House, there's no food there, there's no other services related there. So what would happen back, and this is like 2004, 2005, they would then go back into downtown Olympia, they would get food at Salvation Army, they would still be utilizing Salvation Army as kind of a hub, and then at night they would come and then basically be serviced or at least they could go sleep at the White House. So we have that same dilemma. We do have a facility like that available. The question is, who would be that provider? Can they provide the transportation and also the supervision support that would be needed?
Great, thank you, Scott. Our next question is, it's a more broader question, and relates to, is the city limited by certain roles, or limited to certain roles by RCW? Is there a limitation to the type of service we can provide to the homeless community by RCW, or is it something that is open? And is it?
No, as a city, as a city within the state of Washington, there's no, I guess, limit in terms of what we wanted to do. It becomes an issue in terms of a policy vision for city council, and then providing the direction that this is what we're going to do. I mean, that's a pretty broad ask. This, we were talking about traditional roles of city government, especially for the size of the city. This is maybe a new role for us as the more we get involved in this, but there's no statutory limitations on assisting the poor. The Constitution, actually, Washington specifically allows the use of public dollars to help the poor and the infirm, and that typically falls under that. So it's not a gift of public funds. That would be well within the right of a city to do that if the community and with the support of the community and the direction of the electeds, we could do that.
Thank you. Next question, is it okay to move a homeless person to a shelter if that person refuses? And if not, what can be done?
So I think that's a great question, and I think that's kind of where we're at. So if there is a shelter resource, and we had to do an enforcement of, say, maybe the camping ordinance, and they refuse to go, then they would be cited under that basically camping ordinance. So there would be an enforcement action with it. That would be, I guess, the one tool, if we did have a shelter resource, that you could encourage someone to go to the resource that's set up properly to help the homeless, versus, say, sleeping in a park or sleeping on a sidewalk for the night.
Yeah, and there always is that legal question versus the societal question or the community acceptance question as well in that framework. Next question is, are local governments required to provide shelter to all the homeless in their communities? And what is that legal expectation? I think it goes back to that Boise Martin decision of what's acceptable shelter services or adequate.
And that's an interesting question too. And I think that's some of the dilemma. I think the courts have sort of pointed to, if you're going to enforce certain community standards and you don't have adequate resources for those residents who can't afford, say, housing, then some of those community standards have become invalidated. And I think that becomes the heart of the issue, that, we don't have that ability to do that. So, the question for all cities is that if we're going to maintain certain ordinances or say a camping ordinance, if that's the example, then we would have to build shelter or adequate shelter resources to accommodate that need.
Yeah. Let's see. Our next question is there a definition of emergency housing such as square foot per person, heating, food prep, sanitation? What is the basic needs for emergency housing to provide a shelter?
I'm sure there is probably a commerce definition from the state. I don't know. I don't have one sort of off of the top of my head. I think when it comes to shelter, I think, you're talking, if you want to go back to the basis of the Martin versus Boise decision, it's somewhere to sleep and, obviously have bathroom facilities. Those seems to be the two issues that cities are running up against. I think if that would, in a sense, be adequate shelter. It doesn't require you to provide any other services related to that, but it does sort of beg the question, if you're starting to provide that level of support, is there food part of that? Is there other hygiene issues related to that, either be shower or washing stations or even laundry? It sort of gets in that whole issue. What is that social service support that you can provide someone that's homeless?
And as I've learned through this process as well, that the shelter can take on many different stages, from just an overnight shelter where it's just a place to bed down for the night, or a warming shelter, to something that has full capabilities or long-term and provides supported services. So, and there are.
So, Rick, has the group talked about the Conestoga hut? Have they talked about that as a shelter option?
No, the group hasn't gotten into solutions or strategy yet. They're still working on the principles and goals and getting information on the problem. And we're going ready for an open house. And after that, then they'll start getting into specific strategies and solution sets.
Okay. Well, I guess going back to shelter, I think you've seen a couple sort of, it runs the gamut. If you go to downtown, not quite downtown Tacoma, but they've built a large tent that houses smaller tents, and they have provided food, they've provided washing facilities, showers, and they also have pallet houses for people to kind of get beyond the tents. Even the city of Olympia in their downtown area, all they provided was basically porta potties and tents. And then Walla Walla, they provided kind of a grouping of Conestoga huts, just kind of like the wagon without the wheels, but it really didn't offer other than getting out of the elements. So shelter really is getting out of the elements and maybe providing some basic facilities like porta potties.
And the question about square foot per person, I don't know of a square foot standard per person for a shelter, but I know that issue has come up during the COVID-19 response and having to actually lose shelter capacity because of having to have minimum separations in response to the pandemic. So it kind of goes in both directions in that respect. Great. All right. The next question is a kind of a question I think we've heard stated concerns throughout this whole process as a homeless topic has come up. What are your thoughts on, if you build it, they will come problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's hard not to ignore. Anecdotally, it feels that way. It feels like every time that there is a resource that is communicated that a city is building so many shelter beds, or they're building some means, either it be tents or some other program to help the homeless. Um, it does have the sense. And I think again, anecdotally, you do hear people coming from, say, Seattle or Tacoma and coming to the Olympia area and Lacey because they've heard that, quite frankly, there's services in the area and they're trying to improve the situation. And so I think there's competing views on that, but anecdotally, you do hear that a lot, and it's hard to refute.
Thank you. So this next question I'm asked is related to the problem of a catch-22, and if the pros can't solve it, why expect the committee to? And I think it goes back to the overall mission or the expectation the city council has on the expectations for the committee to get together and come up with a solution. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as a outcome that can be valued by the city council with the committee's work?
So I think that's a really good question. I kind of come up with sort of the phrase of, we can only go fast as the speed of the community. I mean, we may have the greatest idea, but if it doesn't have support of the community, then why are we spending time and resources in that? And we have kind of reached this critical stage of how do we best respond to homelessness? And I know we have experts in talking about it, but I feel like to some degree we've not defined the problem appropriately. I think, again, we're still stuck in a traditional lens of homelessness where someone's lost their job, someone came from an environment in their family that basically forced them out of that living situation, or they don't have the means to pay for rent. And so again, I think our traditional model, we had, United Way, Union Gospel, Salvation Army that were able to deal with those type of things. But again, I think we're seeing, again, a new level and numbers that we haven't seen before of mental illness and drug addiction that has complicated that issue. And we don't have services for that. And I think to some degree, it's not so much an issue of expertise. I think it's an issue of the community recognizing what the true problem is through good information and facts, and in a sense, petition city council, hey, this is what we think you should do, and this is what we support because we recognize this is the only way that we can solve this problem. I mentioned before, though, and there's a long history on the dismantling of the mental health system really in the country. That is a huge issue that can't be ignored. And to some degree, my frustration, again, is at the state level where I believe this is their responsibility. And I'm not trying to transfer the responsibility or blame, but at some point, the state is in charge of the mental health facilities or the system. And then what role can they do to help play? Because quite frankly, by them ignoring that responsibility, now all communities are suffering from it. So again, this is still your community. We can listen to experts and everything, but again, this is your quality of life. This is your community standard. And if you say this is what we want to see in the community, then we got to figure out practical solutions to meet that community standard. This is what it's all about. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in a malaise and we're going to be talking about this and talking around each other without any real solution. So we first have to start of, one is what should be the community standard, and then recognize what are the aspects of the problem so we can actually, have a thoughtful discussion about it and make policy initiatives or other petitions at higher levels of government to solve this problem.
Yeah, and that, just to add on a little bit too, is solve is a big word, and ultimately the community is not expected to solve the problem, but also just to say, what is it, like as you said, Scott, what does the community expect and how the city responds to homelessness, and what is supported by the community, and that's that litmus test that the city and the council needs to understand as they try to take strategies forward.
Well, and again, I go back to what is the community standard? The community sets the standard. Now, granted, there's tradition with the community in terms of what either be maintenance of our parks or maintenance of our road, but there's an expectations of the public of what their community should be. And quite frankly, I'm struck by the fact that we've gotten to, and I'll use Seattle as an example, when did it become the community standard that you would have such visible homelessness that people don't want to go to downtown Seattle anymore? I mean, that is a failure to recognize, one, that should be the community standard. We shouldn't accept that. We should accept that for the individuals that are, again, either getting to homelessness, however they got there, and figuring out better ways to get them out, and then hold everyone to a higher expectation.
Thank you. The next question is more, I think, of a personal opinion. But do you think, the question is, do you think homelessness is a personal choice? And I'll just leave that, and I'll let you answer that as a what you see from a city perspective, I guess.
I think that's a tough question to answer. I guess I would answer it in this way. I think, again, if someone is suffering from mental illness or drug addiction, and when we apply the lens of is that personal choice, I would argue I'm not quite sure they're making good decisions because of the current mental state that they're in or chemical dependency that they're in. So that's a difficult one. I believe there's probably a percentage of people that, for whatever reason, not that I'd want to choose that lifestyle, but find themselves in this lifestyle that they're able to navigate. I don't think anyone would want to choose to be homelessness. But again, when we lack the tools to, I guess, guide someone into the right direction, and this goes back to what's the community standard, what's the community expectation, then what we are going to have when we have no rules, we have no guidance, there's no resources, then we are left with, an encampment. We can't do anything. What do we do? And it seems to be that, I guess through that inaction, seems like a personal choice, because again, I think we have a hard time recognizing why anyone would live in that condition. But it is it's a redefining a community standard, which is a little bit interesting.
Thank you. So next question is, do you know of any information that the longer a person is homeless, the more problems of mental health and drug use take hold? If so, do you believe that sooner we intervene, the sooner the chance for success? I've been a great question for our some of our mental health and addiction experts we had on the previous panel. But I'll pose a question to you, Scott. Are you familiar with any information out there that has that definitive study?
I'm not aware of that, but I guess I would just go back to we should intervene at the earliest point to stop whatever suffering that individual's in. I mean, again, I go back to, I think we're a compassionate community. I think to some degree, you're suffering from mental illness without the proper care. It's not uncommon to then turn to drugs to relieve whatever issues that you're currently suffering from. And so that's a problem. So again, early intervention makes the most sense, even from just a timeline issue of cost to the public, as well as to the detriment of that individual's health. It just makes sense to do early intervention. I think to some degree, if you talk about the broad spectrum of homelessness, it makes a lot of sense to invest more time and energy on the youth of our homelessness. So how, through no fault of their own, they find themselves in a situation either because their parents abandoned them or for whatever life circumstances they could not overcome, they have nowhere to go. So at what point, we need to basically focus on that issue too and try to help those folks out as early as possible. Otherwise, they will get into a cycle of homelessness that will be, again, a failure of society, I guess you will, because we failed to intervene early, but also for that individual is going to be impacted a lot longer.
This refers back to, I think, the previous question on homeless shelters. The first question we went off to, what capacity are shelters available in Lacey or not? And the question is, Olympia is able to find shelter managers or operators. Can you expand on why, say, any of our nonprofit partners don't want to or have not agreed to operate the White House, for example, for a shelter operation?
I think part of it is that they're at capacity. I think our current organizations are at capacity in terms of resources. I mean, that means we may have to look outside of our area if we're going to try to get someone in. Unfortunately, sometimes when government touches problems, it becomes more expensive in terms of how we, with the certain laws that we do when it comes to prevailing wage and other issues like that. But that's my first blush at that, why we haven't had more providers step up. I think they're dealing with their own crisis. Again, not that I think this is an easier conversation if COVID hasn't happened, but as Rick talked about, I think the capacity almost got reduced by a third, if not a half, in terms of our current shelter capacity pre-COVID. And so now everyone's sort of in a crisis mode trying to manage what they currently have, but also deal with the people that got displaced. Then you have another issue, just growing population entering into the area, and how do you do that? So it's kind of a threefold problem, if you will.
Yeah, and it's also, as you mentioned before, the logistics as well. And the service providers are at capacity, but then if you're having to transport individuals to a shelter location, transport them back in the morning, you rely on a very extensive volunteer network that needs to be reliable. And so it also is that logistic piece of not being in a core area where you can benefit from the proximity of concentration of services.
Well, and I go back to the cost because again, at some point, money does drive a lot of things. I mean, at some point, if this work group ultimately says, "Look, Lacey, you should build a shelter," okay, there's going to be a cost of building that shelter. And then at some point, who's going to manage the shelter? I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Rick. I think the tiny homes that were built off of Plum Street, I think you're pushing close to $600,000 annually to do that. Now, I may be wrong on those figures, but we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain that. Now, Olympia passed a home fund, so that partially explains how they're able to get in that business. We're trying to maintain currently what we have in terms of traditional services. So the question mark comes, the community group ultimately says, look, we should do this. There has to be some kind of other funding revenue if we're going to manage that type of scale of direct intervention.
I want to take a pause here because we are up against coming close to the 60-minute period for our webinar, and we still have quite a few questions that keep coming in. And I'm going to just check with you, Scott, on availability. Do you have maybe 10 more minutes to see how many more questions we can work through? And I'll kind of go through the questions that maybe are different than or consistent or a different strain than what we've seen before.
Yeah, I mean, believe me, I have as much time as you would allow me to. This issue is too important. And again, I think council, as I said before, has put a lot of weight in what the opinions are of this work group. So I'll take as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, would it be possible to train HL people, which I believe is short for homeless people, to provide supervision and services at shelters? Now, I'll take an initial stab of that because I do know that a lot of our shelter operators do employ individuals that have been through the homeless experience, but they do need to get to a state where they have some stability in order to manage the facility and manage other people. So there is quite a few of our shelters are supervised by those individuals that have successfully navigated this moving out of the homeless situation. But somebody in the throes of homelessness may not have all the capacity to manage and supervise a shelter and manage the rules and operation and any issues that may arise. Our next question is, if one of the homeless individuals are posing a risk to themselves or others, are there services available where they can be provided treatment or care other than jail? And maybe I can just elaborate on that question too. Right now, our first point of response to an individual that's homeless, that's in a crisis situation, is generally our law enforcement, police department. What are the tools that they have to be able to provide assistance to that individual?
Yeah, again, I think we're very limited. You do have Providence. I mean, if there is someone that was going to injure themselves, clearly there's facility there, but that is limited capacity. We do have a mental health facility that's in the Woodland Square area. There's limited capacity there, but that's also a high bar, if you will, if someone is in such a crisis mode where they're a threat to somebody else or themselves, before we can actually commit them to a mental health facility. Again, this is where an area we do need more flexibility, more tools, that we can be more agile. And I'm sure you've kind of talked about this before. Law enforcement is we ask a lot of our law enforcement officers in terms of policing the community, and then we're now overlaying a social service issue where we actually probably need a team of social service responders dealing with these type of issues, either be counselors or mental health experts or other specialists, versus having, law enforcement professional have to show up on a situation that could use other perspectives and insights. So that's something that, again, that's why we added the social service navigator and working with Community Action Council. We've had some discussion about having a mental health expert to be part of a team to be able to intervene and actually provide, again, more moderate tools, if you will, to be able to respond to these type of crises. And I think that's an evolving situation.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Next question is somewhat of a forward-looking question, is in the state's role. What are the one or two things that the state can do to help local communities deal with the homeless issue?
So I think to some degree, I almost want to turn back time. I think the state of Washington needs to build capacity and mental health infrastructure instead of sort of this decade-long dismantling of that. So I think to some degree, and again, this is going to cost money and this is going to impact residents and taxpayers. But again, you can't solve a mental health crisis that we're currently sort of, it's either in our jails or it's in, potentially, in homeless encampments, and expect that to be, the option. I mean, at some point they need to be in facilities with experts and proper support services. So at some point, that's where the state needs to take a leadership role. I mean, that's far afield from what a local government has been charged with or even has the capacity to do. Or if they do, then we need, I guess, legislative direction and the dollars that go with that to create, in a sense, a mental health division, if you will, to be able to respond to that. But ultimately means having the services, a facility to be able to help those individuals suffering from that.
And then with that and trying to build capacity from the state system, I have a question related to the state certificate of need requirement and should they drop it? But I'm going to kind of expound on that a little bit. Is how does the state process for bringing on additional facilities in the community, their review of it, how does that either help or create a challenge for providing services on the street level?
Well, I think it hurts in the sense that, I mean, we can go into a kind of a lengthy process about how that whole is developed, but quite frankly, local governments aren't really involved in the certificate of need process other than we're going to locate a facility and we got to go through your land use process. We're not asked in terms of what the local need is for, say, mental health services in the area. I mean, typically when they did the latest mental health facility that's, again, just right by City Hall, is the fact they looked at a 5-county region and they're looking at data and number of cases per thousand. And again, there wasn't much outreach, and this is all done at the provider level, and they're sort of looking at what the demand or the market is. And that's how then they petition the state to say, we want authority to build a facility. And then the states, it's very highly, regulated. They're trying not to overbuild capacity because at some point it has to be financially sustainable. And again, if we're working on that model, that's where there's a failure, where I feel like there is an undercapacity for these type of facilities, and where the state probably needs to take a more active role and not just allow the free market to be able to provide mental health facilities.
Thank you.
Did I get at that question, Rick?
Yeah, I think so. And I've had a lot of direct experience in those type of facility processes and that certificate of need. And it is, if I could add on to it, I would say that there needs to be a little bit better coordination at the state level and the local level in those processes, because there's some unnecessary delays in them because they're trying to define what that need is at the regional level. But then you also have other providers in there that are involved in that process from an adversarial role. And so trying to figure out really what that community need is and coordinating that with the local land use process can help make that a much more efficient and predictable and bring things online, maybe in a quicker manner. Okay, let's see. Going back to your comments earlier, Scott, on developing a response to homelessness and what is that community standard? What is that, Beth? What does a community standard look like to you? How do you think that with the work that the work group on homelessness and other outreach efforts that we have done, the faith leaders, how do you see that community standard looking like and developing into a framework?
Well, when I talk about community standard, again, I never thought, I mean, in being 25 years in local government, that we would find ourselves that, again, our highways would be makeshift homeless encampments. I mean, I don't think I could have predicted that. I mean, we're not talking about the Great Recession. So in terms of, I'd say, community standard, why is that an acceptable living condition for those individuals? And ultimately, it does fall on the community to help solve that problem for those individuals that can't solve that. And so when I say establishing a community standard, I guess the vision is that should not be occurring. So then you start going down the solution set, which is, okay, if we can't have people there, then what shelter infrastructure do we need to build? But it goes beyond that. At some point, a shelter is a stopgap. At some point, you need, affordable housing with supportive services. Otherwise, a shelter is just a temporary stay. At some point, how do you get that person? Do you try to get them a job? Can they hold a job? What are the services that they need? What mental health services that they need? So I'm struck by the fact that if you have an individual who is homeless that is afflicted by multiple issues, what is that system that we need to basically build to get them from homelessness into a stabilized environment, which would be shelter, and then ultimately into supportive housing? I think that's really the route. And that is what the experts do say, get someone out of the homeless situation into a stable environment, and then find out what services they need, and then ultimately get them in supportive housing. And I think for too long, and I'll use the analogy, again, this is from a judge that was in Thurston County, the argument was, it's kind of like prison reform. You send someone to jail and you lock the door for 3 years. And if you don't do anything to that individuals and you expect them to have a different outcome without providing any sort of reform to that prisoner. So that'd be akin to taking your favorite classic car, putting in a garage with a broken engine, close the door, lift it up, and then assume it's all going to be fixed. I mean, the same thing to a degree with the individual that's experiencing homelessness. You need to take that individual, figure out what those needs are, and then be able to put them in an environment where they can succeed. And I think they're not going to succeed on the side of a highway, I guess is the point. So the question is, how do we invest in the infrastructure to make them successful and get out of that state of homelessness?
Great. Thank you. And part of that community standard too is, again, when you start looking at solutions, if the city or the council is going to say, we're going to go down this path and build shelters, there's got to be revenue associated or diversion of funds. What's supportable by the community? What is the community willing to accept as that response in order to deal with the needs that are in our schools, the needs that are in our family units, and the needs that are in the encampments that we see? And so part of that community standard too is what is that acceptable, those strategies and actions, and that is supported ultimately by the community in their support of the local government.
And I'm mindful too, I mean, this is all about also priorities of the government. I mean, at some point, if that community standard can't be reached because there's other demands on the community, we got to weigh the community standard with what we can afford and other priorities that we have for government. So that all has to be sort of thought when we talk about that.
And kind of I'm going to combine two of these questions, and I think it's in response to that question around personal choice. And again, it's easy to get locked into a certain segment. The questions are, what about, in response, I believe, is what about the 40% of homeless who are family units with children, or the 1,300 homeless students in the school district? And again, it's one of those challenges with that. It's a question of, it's too black and white of a question for a problem that's very complex and has many different facets to it. So not every situation's the same. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity, Scott, to maybe want to elaborate on that in terms of how we respond to, if we always talk about the encampments. Those are very visible, especially on DOT right away. But what about those that are the families with children and the students? What are some things that the city's been doing or looking into related to that part of the homeless demographic?
So in terms of, I guess, the youth, which again, that's a concerning issue, we did help the city or the school district with their family youth center. And so we gave them a grant to help rebuild their shower facilities and also washing facilities, to be able to provide an additional resource for that, in a sense, a hub. I think you'll hear the leadership at North Thurston Public Schools talk about the family support or family youth center as kind of a very similar to the Lacey Veteran Services Hub, in terms of trying to provide a resource for those families struggling with homelessness, or those, unfortunately, teens or younger suffering from homeless, so they have a place to go, potentially get food, be able to take a shower, even it means clothes and all those type of things. So we've been in support of that project. I think the difficult thing about homelessness is we focus on the people with the encampments or where they're at in terms of the city. I guess because this is a multi-pronged approach, we have this almost ecosystem of poverty. So we are working with Thurston Food Bank to try to have a Lacey Food Bank presence on Martin Way. So that actually is going vertical right now, but that was a leadership issue with council and Thurston County Food Bank to try to get another resource. And food security, I mean, is another part of the whole poverty equation. So if you can't pay rent or a utility bill, but you're able to get, say, food support from the food bank, and that could maybe help out the current problem the family's experiencing. You know, we talk about the affordable housing. We're trying to provide affordable housing opportunities as much as we can with an evolving market. When we're talking about waiving fees for Habitat for Humanity because they are building affordable housing for people that are low and moderate income. So again, those are some of the initiatives that we're trying to help. So either be helping the school with their family youth center, that'd be the food bank and trying to help them build a facility and raising awareness and helping them raise money through private means, or trying to help the building community to try to be able to waive certain fees that they may see as a barrier so we can actually accelerate affordable housing. And again, this is not just to be solved by building a shelter. We have to do 20 different things to kind of deal with the issue of poverty.
Great, thank you. And I do have two other, I'm going to call them comments. They're more, they have some of those questions, but I think they're more comments. So I'm going to just go ahead and leave those as they are. And if there's anybody that asks questions, want to follow up with me after the webinar, I'll be happy to follow up with any other questions that they have. Before we conclude, Scott, I just want to maybe ask one question that really wasn't touched upon in the question and answer period, but you had mentioned it in the actions of the city in, I think it's 2019 and going into 2020, and that's that regional response and that coordination. Can you maybe provide a little comment or perspective of what regional coordination may look like and how that works within the umbrella of, say, the regional government, the county, and their efforts in dealing with housing, supportive services, funding, and the funding models to provide services down to the homeless level?
Yeah, and I know, and this is kind of a point of pride when we say where you're from Lacey, and I have that. But when we talk about regional resources that assist people that are low income or facing homelessness and shelter resources, the fact of the matter is a lot of that is retained in the capital of Olympia or the city of Olympia. And so that's just sort of a natural, you're next to the seat of government. That's where a lot of the Salvation Army, Union Gospel, United Way has just, decided to locate. And I think to some degree, we got to think of those resources as regional resources, not just maybe the city of Olympia resources. I think we need to be very deliberate when we talk about policy, because as we talked about with the no boundaries, if we do not have consistent policies, we are going to negatively impact one another. And to some degree, we need to be all on the same page on what we think the best approach is for homelessness, because by the inaction of another jurisdiction, by, say, not enforcing parking, then that's going to cause an issue. The mention about build it and they will come. I mean, there is some degree of a path of least resistance. And so why did the Chutes Parkway become a problem? Because the state of Washington did not regulate their parking. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. And so more and more people came there and became a bigger problem. If that was intervened early on, I think that'd be less of a problem. So that's just one example of regional coordination where we have consistent policy. If we don't have consistent policies, we are going to struggle a lot longer. So that's another one. And then we got to treat regional resources, even if they're located in a singular entity, as regional resources, and not get into this sort of competitiveness like, well, you can't use those resources. City of Lacey has long supported Salvation Army, long supported United Way, given dollars to Family Support Network and all other charitable organizations that service this area. And so this is a situation where we all need to kind of maybe shed the jurisdictional boundaries and sort of accept that fact.
Great, thank you. And being able to start developing a platform for having those consistent policies and regulations and coordinations of services at a regional level starts with each jurisdiction having a plan of what the expectations are, so there's something to go forward. So you have the countywide plan, the 5-year response plan the county's put together, you have the Olympia 1 plan, and this process that our work group's working on to develop a plan for Lacey will then provide that consistency and a spot where all the jurisdictions can work from and create that coordinated response. So again, pivoting back to the work group and our audience is that's the main reason why we're looking at you to develop this process and engage the community and develop this recommendation. So at the end of the day, we have a plan that the city council can take on in their response to homelessness that's not only specific to Lacey, but also can be regionally coordinated and work with our regional partners.
And Rick, maybe just a final comment. I think the reason there's been so much weight given to this work group is that this is a controversial issue. I mean, even just from the questions that we've had here in the last sort of, 20, 30 minutes, I mean, there's a lot of opinions on, people finding themselves in homeless. Why aren't they getting out of homelessness? What's the best way to get them out of homelessness? And so we do need to have a united sort of approach on what's the best way to help these individuals that the community can't agree to. Because again, if we, go down a path that no one agrees with, that's going to paralyze this whole decision-making process. So again, I appreciate your time and effort in this and being deliberate about it, but we really do need sort of guidance from the community to help with this major policy decision.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. That's a great note to end on. And then do you want to just pass on a comment from one of our viewers saying thank you to you? It's been a very useful presentation, and I do agree with that. And again, I want to thank all our attendees tonight for taking the time to listen to this and fire away some great questions and spoke some great conversations with our city manager, Scott Spence. Going forward, just want to make sure that everybody's aware that we will post all the information, Scott's slide presentation on Basecamp, as well as to our webpage on homelessness. Within that presentation, there'll be links to those various court cases that were referenced and other background documents. So all this information will be made available to the work group. And I just want to remind the work group members, tomorrow we have our fifth in our series of webinars at Speakers Bureau, which is tomorrow at a different time. It's at 12 o'clock noon, and we'll be having a conversation about veteran services. We'll have Keith Luker, who is director of the Lacey Veteran Services Hub here in Lacey, as well as Sean Liu from the Veterans Administration, to talk about the programs and services are available to veterans and how they deliver those to that community. So again, thank you, Scott, for a great presentation tonight, and look forward to the work group taking that information and bringing it into part of their conversations. And with that, thank you and good night.
Thank you.